Carbon sequestration potential. Welcome to this lesson about the potential of carbon sequestration in agriculture. After this lesson, we should be able to understand the role of soil in carbon emissions, to explain the potential of soils for carbon sequestration, and to describe the effect of different land use methods on potential carbon sequestration. We have known for a very long time that we need to significantly reduce the CO2 content in the atmosphere as soon as possible. However, not much has been undertaken in the last couple of years. Recently, agriculture has come into focus not only as an emitter of greenhouse gases, but also as a reservoir for greenhouse gases. CO2 certificates, where companies buy certificates to compensate for their greenhouse gas emissions, has become popular. With the money from these certificates, farmers and projects are supported to build up humus in their soils. Apart from the question of how useful such certificates are for effectively reducing greenhouse gas concentration, and also how permanent such a sequestration really is, the question arises how much potential soils really offer for CO2 storage. And this is exactly the question that I'd like to explore in this lesson. On the one hand, it is clear that the way we practice agriculture today leads to CO2 being released from the soil into the atmosphere, mainly through the oxidation of humus. On the one hand, it is clear that the way we practice agriculture today is leading to CO2 being released from the soil into the atmosphere, mainly through the oxidation of humus. After all, up to 1/3 of the excess of CO2 in the atmosphere comes from the soil. This is mainly due to plowing, which repeatedly brings up humus, more than half of which consists of carbon, into contact with atmospheric oxygen, which then leads to its oxidation. Soil erosion also plays a significant factor leading to CO2 emissions, as fertile, humus-rich soil is washed away. Models help show us the extent of these humus losses around the world. The yellow areas on the map show soil erosion carbon losses of 5 to 15 tons per hectare. In the red areas, the values are over 50 tons. Clearly visible are some particularly hard-hit areas in the world: the Central Asian region, Eastern China, the west coast of Australia, the northeast of the USA, southern Latin America, and Central Europe. From Ireland and England to parts of France, Germany, Poland, and further east, large areas show losses of well over 50 tons. So this is an issue that concerns all of us, including us here in Europe. According to estimates by various scientists, up to 40% of the additional CO2 released into the atmosphere by humans comes from land use changes and land use, half of which are caused by the oxidation of soil carbon. An astonishing amount of carbon is stored in the world's soils, 3 times as much as in the atmosphere and twice as much as in the atmosphere and the biological pool put together. The man-made share of atmospheric CO2 is about 1/3, although we would have to add more to it, as 1/3 of the anthropogenic CO2 emissions and more than 90% of the additional anthropogenic heat generated by it has been absorbed and buffered by the oceans. When we talk about global temperature rise, we should be aware that we are only seeing 10% of the total effect. If we look at models and ask what the different sectors, transport, buildings, industry, electricity, and land use, can do to stabilize CO2 levels in the atmosphere to 450 ppm, a level clearly not sufficient, we can see that all sectors can actually produce less CO2, but not lead to negative emissions. Only in the land use sector we see a strong potential for removing CO2 from the atmosphere, not just emitting less. In this sector, we find agriculture, forestry, tillage, and landscaping. It is the only sector that can produce the negative emissions given here with a potential of around 10 gigatons of CO2 or 2.7 gigatons of carbon per year. Humanity emits about 10 gigatons of carbon per year through the use of fossil fuels. Land use changes, especially deforestation and oxidation of soil carbon, also have a negative impact on the atmosphere of about 2 gigatons. Oceans absorb and sequester large amounts of human-produced CO2. Around 3 gigatons are sequestered on land and 2.5 in the oceans. Over time, this has led to a sink of 155 gigatons on land, mainly in vegetation, and 170 gigatons in the ocean. About 250 gigatons are stuck in the atmosphere. Many model calculations have been made in recent years to find out how much CO2 soils worldwide could store or sequester. These estimates vary greatly and range from about 2 to 7 gigatons per year. In the best case, that would be 2/3 of what we blow into the air. But even in the lower estimations, this is still about 20%, and thus a noteworthy contribution. So what is the potential of different methods of carbon storage? Here we can see on the x-axis, logarithmically, the average greenhouse gas reduction rate per hectare and per year. On the y-axis, also logarithmic, is the possible total area worldwide for that measure. And for each measure, the amount of carbon is shown in gigatons. We can see that some methods, such as grazing management, top left in green, or a modified arable management, can of course be introduced or implemented on wide areas of land, while, for example, the regenerating of peatlands, bottom right, is only possible on small areas worldwide. On the other hand, the potential for carbon sequestration is much higher in peatlands than all other measures. And clearly, according to this study, there is potential for carbon sequestration. Peatlands are particularly interesting in this respect. If we include agroforestry and do not limit the potential there to soil alone, but also include the fixation of carbon in wood, then, as we can see here, and the values are really only a rough estimate based on several reports, there's very large potential for fixing carbon. An exciting project is Drawdown, which has investigated the carbon fixation potential of hundreds of different methods. These have ranged from using different coolants through education methods to agriculture. What's particularly interesting in this study is from the top 20 solutions, 12 involve the agriculture and food sector. From agroforestry to modified pasture management and minimal tillage methods, many approaches can be seen that we know from regenerative agriculture. So here is a confirmation from another side that the potential for carbon sequestration via new ways in agriculture is realistic. If we look at the distribution of carbon in the soil on arable land and grassland in Germany, we see that on average, just under 100 tons of carbon per hectare can be found in the topmost meter of arable land, with 2/3 of this stored in the top 30 centimeters. On grassland, the figure is significantly higher at around 135 tons, and it is even clearer that the upper humic horizon stores significantly more carbon. If we now put these two quantities in relation to the carbon storage in peatlands, we again see that peatlands are much more capable in sequestering carbon. So when we talk about potentials of agriculture for carbon sequestration, it should be clear to us that peatlands have a key role to play in this. But this discussion, regenerating peatlands and thus removing appropriately drained wetlands, is perhaps even more difficult to address than the issue of humus building on normal arable land. If we look at the carbon sequestration potential of different farming methods, here using the example of a study in Bavaria and Germany, we see that for a certain number of years, as one cannot build up humus endlessly, the different approaches such as green manure, the incorporation of green manures, improved crop rotation, conversion to organic farming can sequester between 0.2 and 0.3 tons of carbon per hectare per year. The conversion of arable land to grassland and the integration of agroforestry can sequester around 0.7 tons per hectare per year. If these measures were taken on all arable land in Bavaria, 370,000 tons of carbon could be stored annually. In the course of the UN Climate Conference in Paris in 2015, a global humus building program was launched, the so-called 4 per mille initiative, which proposes an annual increase in global soil carbon stocks by 4 per mille, which would almost offset all anthropogenic CO2 emissions. However, the measures applied in this study here would only correspond to about 30% of this target when broken down to Bavaria. If we look at the total greenhouse gas emissions of Germany and compare it with the greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural use of peatlands, and then again with the sequestration potential roughly extrapolated to Germany in the study, it becomes clear that in contrast to these emissions, sequestration in the soil is only small. Nevertheless, the effects of humus buildup are numerous and should be used. In addition, there are some measures that have not been considered in this study, but which are very promising in our context, which are the use of undersowing, the integration of deep-rooted cover crops, the use of compost, holistic pasture management, the integration of animals into the field, or the use of plant charcoal. With the help of these and other methods, significantly greater carbon accumulations in the soil are certainly possible. And the good news is, as already shown on another graph before, in addition to the accumulation of carbon in soils, we should definitely pay more attention to carbon sequestration in the form of wood. A recent study shows the potential of hedgerows in temperate latitudes. And this amounts to a strong 100 tons per hectare per year and includes an astonishing carbon accumulation in the soil, in the biomass of the plants, and in the soil as well as the above ground. And this amounts to a strong 100 tons per hectare per year and includes an astonishing carbon accumulation in the soil, in the biomass of the plants in the soil, as well as above ground. Basically, we should not see the soil one-sidedly as a carbon storage unit, which does not correspond to the complexity of the soil and the relationship between plants, soil life, and soil. It is important to keep the diversity of positive properties of humus in mind and to consistently promote these or the measures that lead to the formation of humus. This means avoiding mineral fertilizers, pesticides, and heavy equipment, and rather cultivating cover crops and undersow crops, using minimal tillage, integrating animals, using compost, and integrating trees and shrubs, and many other methods in the toolbox of regenerative agriculture. Humus is therefore not only a carbon store, but leads to increased water storage capacity and infiltration, better soil structure, and thus reduced soil erosion. It also serves as a store and source of nutrients. It has phytosanitary potential. It helps increase soil life and can stabilize and increase crop yields. And yes, it also is climate positive. Thank you for watching this lesson on the potentials of carbon sequestration.